The reflection in the Venetian crystal mirror didn't lie. Carson Montgomery could clearly see the small beads of sweat beginning to form on his forehead, marring the perfection of his meticulously constructed appearance. Eleanor's words still echoed in her ears, like a macabre melody that threatened to crumble her empire of glass and steel. "I know what you did last night." Turning slowly, Carson faced the woman who, until that moment, had been nothing more than a shadow in her luxury penthouse on Manhattan's Upper East Side. Eleanor Banks remained motionless, her green eyes fixed on him with a disturbing intensity. There was not the slightest trace of typical female employee submissiveness in her gaze, just an unshakable certainty that made the powerful CEO of Montgomery Industries feel inexplicably vulnerable. "Miss Banks," he began, his controlled voice masking the inner turmoil, "I believe we need to talk about your observation." Carson indicated the Italian leather armchairs next to the picture window that offered a privileged view of Central Park. Eleanor moved with a feline grace that seemed out of place for someone who spent her days organizing other people's lives. Her simple governess uniform contrasted with the regal posture she assumed as she sat down. "There's not much to talk about, Mr. Montgomery. Your actions at Brightline Technologies were quite eloquent." The blood ran cold in Carson's veins. Brightline was his Achilles heel, a hostile takeover he had meticulously planned for months. Last night's transaction should have been invisible, a surgical strike that would leave the company vulnerable to its takeover offer next week. How could this woman, who he barely knew, know? "Fascinating how power can blind people," Eleanor continued, her delicate fingers playing with the watch she still held, the same one that moments before she had used as a pretext for her approach. "Did you really believe that no one would notice the documents being destroyed or the calls made from burner phones?" Carson felt control slipping through his fingers like fine sand. In his 15 years leading Montgomery Industries, he had built an impeccable reputation. At age 42, he was considered one of New York's most successful CEOs, transforming the family company into a global conglomerate. Now a housekeeper threatened to destroy it all. "What exactly do you want, Miss Banks?" he asked, resorting to his most trusted tactic, direct negotiation. An enigmatic smile appeared on Eleanor's lips. "Don't be so predictable, Mr. Montgomery. If I wanted money, I would have already made my demands. What I want is much more interesting." The meeting with international investors would begin in less than an hour at the Montgomery Industries office in downtown Manhattan. Marcus Chen, its most important Asian partner, was flying directly from Singapore to finalize the biggest merger in the company's history. Everything was at risk now. "I'll make a different proposal." Eleanor stood up, gently adjusting the pleats of her uniform. "Tonight, at 8 p.m., at Le Bernardin. Dinner, just you and me. There we will discuss the terms of our agreement." "Why should I trust you?" Carson questioned, his mind already calculating all the possible ramifications of this encounter. "Because, unlike you, Mr. Montgomery, I showed my cards. The question is, are you prepared to see the rest of the game?" Eleanor walked towards the door, leaving the clock on the coffee table. Before leaving, he turned around one last time. "Oh, and don't worry about the reservations. They've already been made in your name." When the door closed softly behind her, Carson allowed herself to collapse into the armchair. His cell phone vibrated, a message from his assistant reminding him of the impending meeting. How could he focus on business when his personal life was about to implode? Looking out the window, he observed the city he always considered his private kingdom. The skyscrapers reflected the morning light like spears pointed at the sky, symbols of the power and ambition that had always motivated him. Now, for the first time in his life, Carson Montgomery felt like a stranger in his own domain. He got up, adjusted his tie once more, and picked up his briefcase. He had a meeting to run and an empire to protect. But as the elevator descended the 45 floors to the lobby, his mind was fixed on a single question. Who really was Eleanor Banks, and what could she possibly want beyond the obvious? The driver opened the door of the armored Mercedes, and Carson slid into the vehicle with the rehearsed grace of years of privilege. As the car navigated Manhattan's morning traffic, he couldn't help but think that his perfectly controlled life was about to take a completely unexpected course. And the most disturbing thing was that a part of him, a part that had long been silenced by power and responsibility, was curiously excited by this prospect. The boardroom on the 40th floor of Montgomery Industries pulsed with the energy of 12 of Asia's most powerful executives. Carson watched Marcus Chen's presentation through a mask of professional concentration, while his mind continued to relive the disturbing encounter with Eleanor Banks. As you can see, expanding into the Southeast Asian market represents a unique opportunity. Marcus gestured toward the graphics projected on the glass wall. With the strategic acquisition of Brightline Technologies, Carson felt his stomach tighten. That name again. Discreetly, he took his smartphone from under the table and typed Eleanor Banks into the search. Thousands of results appeared, but none that could connect him to the mysterious woman who had turned his morning into a nightmare. "Mr. Montgomery?" Marcus's voice brought him back to reality. "Your thoughts on the proposed governance structure?" "Sorry, Marcus." Carson adjusted himself in the leather chair, resuming his role as unflappable CEO. "The structure seems solid, but I suggest we review the percentages of Asian board participation." The meeting continued for another 2 hours, during which Carson demonstrated why he was considered one of the shrewdest executives on Wall Street. But behind every calculated decision and every controlled smile, his mind was working on another problem. How had a simple housekeeper obtained information about an operation that only 3 people in the world should know about? When the last executive left the room, Carson remained seated, looking out at the city through the floor-to-ceiling windows. New York stretched out beneath him like a 3-dimensional chessboard, where every move had to be meticulously planned. "Rebecca," her assistant called over the intercom, "I need you to do thorough research on Eleanor Banks. Work history, education, anything you can find." "The new housekeeper, sir?" "Exactly. And Rebecca, keep it discreet." The following hours dragged on between conference calls and contract signings. At 5 p.m., Rebecca walked into her office with a thin folder, dangerously thin for someone who must have had a years-long work history. "Sir, I found very little," she began hesitantly. "Eleanor Banks appears in official records only for the last 5 years. Before that, nothing." Carson leafed through the documents with increasing uneasiness. Harvard degree in economics, 3 years as a consultant at a private equity firm in Boston. Impeccable recommendations from influential families as a housekeeper. Everything seemed perfect. Too perfect. "How did she pass our background checks?" "All documents were in order, sir. Criminal check clean. References confirmed." Carson dismissed Rebecca and loosened his tie, feeling suffocated. Something didn't fit. A Harvard graduate choosing to work as a housekeeper? Impeccable references but a non-existent past before 5 years? Her cell phone vibrated with a message. "Don't be late for dinner. Full formal dress. E." Le Bernardin was one of Manhattan's most exclusive restaurants, known both for its exceptional cuisine and its discretion with high-profile clients. At 7:55 p.m., Carson entered the establishment, his impeccable Tom Ford suit serving as armor. "Mr. Montgomery, welcome," the maitre d' greeted him. "Miss Banks is waiting for you in our private room." When the door to the room opened, Carson had to admit that Eleanor Banks was a woman of surprises. The simple governess uniform had given way to a black dress that appeared to have been custom-made, her dark brown hair now falling in soft waves over her shoulders. But it was his eyes that captured his attention, the same piercing eyes that had challenged his authority that morning. "Punctual as always, Mr. Montgomery," she smiled, indicating the chair in front of her. "I take it your day has been productive? Do you have any idea what a dangerous game you're playing?" Carson asked, keeping his voice low but full of tension. Eleanor took a sip of her red wine before responding. "Dangerous? Perhaps, but necessary. You see, Carson, may I call you Carson? There are certain irregularities in the way you have conducted your business that need to be corrected. If this is an extortion attempt, please, she interrupted him with a gentle gesture. Don't insult me with such basic assumptions. If I wanted money, I would have valuables and bank accounts ready to receive it. What I want is something much more valuable. The sommelier appeared to present the wine, a bottle of Chateau Lafite Rothschild 1982. Eleanor approved with knowledge that bordered on professional, another detail that did not fit with her supposed profession. So, what do you want? I want you to undo what you did to Brightline Technologies, she replied simply. Cancel the hostile takeover, restore the destroyed documents, and allow the company to maintain its independence. Carson felt a wave of anger rise up his neck. Impossible. You have no idea of the implications. Ah, but I do. Eleanor interrupted him again, her smile now carrying a hint of sadness. I have a very clear understanding of the implications, Carson, especially for the 3,000 employees who would lose their jobs after your strategic restructuring. Dinner proceeded like an elaborate dance of power and seduction, each dish served accompanied by more disturbing revelations about Eleanor's knowledge of his operations. As the night progressed, Carson found himself equally fascinated and terrified by this woman who seemed to know him better than he knew himself. When dessert was served, Eleanor leaned forward, her soft scent mixing with the scent of chocolate. You have 48 hours to make your decision, Carson. Choose wisely. With that, she gracefully stood up and left the restaurant, leaving Carson with more questions than answers, and a growing suspicion that Eleanor Banks could be both his salvation and his undoing. The next morning dawned with a thick fog over Manhattan, as if the city itself was conspiring to obscure the truths that Carson so feared to discover. In his office at Montgomery Industries, he watched his penthouse's security cameras through his laptop, obsessively reviewing footage from the past 3 months since Eleanor's arrival. Her every movement now seemed charged with hidden meaning. The way she meticulously organized her documents, how she answered calls at specific times when she thought she was alone, how she occasionally lingered in her personal office longer than necessary for simple cleaning. Mr. Montgomery? Rebecca interrupted her thoughts, walking in with a thick folder in hand. I found something about Eleanor Banks that you need to see. Carson closed the laptop instantly. What did you find? Before she was Eleanor Banks, she was Catherine Price. Rebecca spread some photographs on the table. I worked as a senior analyst at Brightline Technologies for 5 years. Carson's blood ran cold as he examined the images. It was unmistakably Eleanor, younger, with different hair and glasses, but with the same piercing eyes that had challenged him the night before. Continue, he ordered, his mind already calculating the ramifications of this revelation. Catherine Price disappeared after a financial scandal at Brightline. The company was accused of accounting fraud, but nothing was proven. All the crucial documents were just gone. Rebecca hesitated before continuing. Along with her. Carson remembered dinner, Eleanor's thorough knowledge of her operations, her insistence on saving Brightline. The pieces began to fit together, forming a disturbing image. There's more, Rebecca continued. Catherine Price wasn't alone when she disappeared. Her brother, Michael Price, was the CFO of Brightline at the time. He was found dead in his apartment 2 weeks later. Police ruled it a suicide, but you don't believe that, Carson added, studying the newspaper clippings Rebecca had brought. Records show that Michael was about to turn over documents to the FBI about wrongdoing at the company, documents that were never found. Carson felt the weight of realization hit him like an avalanche. Eleanor wasn't just playing a blackmail game. She was executing a revenge that had been meticulously planned for years. His phone buzzed with a message. Central Park, Bethesda Fountain, 3 p.m. Come alone. E. The next few hours were a blur of canceled meetings and elaborate excuses. At 2:45 p.m., Carson crossed the park, his Italian suit clashing with the tourists and joggers enjoying the autumn afternoon. Eleanor was already waiting for him, sitting on the edge of the fountain, feeding breadcrumbs to pigeons. She was dressed in jeans and a casual sweater, looking more like Catherine Price than the elegant housekeeper she knew. "So," she said without looking at him, "you finally figured it out. Why didn't you tell me the truth last night? And miss the opportunity to see the great Carson Montgomery do his homework." She finally faced him, a bitter smile on her lips. "Furthermore, some truths need to be discovered to be truly understood. Your brother." "Don't you dare," she cut in, her voice sharp as a blade. "Michael discovered the truth about Brightline, about how the company had been primed for a hostile takeover scheme for years. He was going to expose everything." "I had nothing to do with it," Carson protested. "Montgomery Industries wasn't even involved with Brightline at that time." "Not directly," Eleanor agreed. "But you knew Benjamin Walsh, didn't you? The CEO of Brightline at the time?" Carson felt his stomach sink. Benjamin had been his mentor early in his career, a man who had taught him a lot about the corporate world, including its darkest shadows. "Ben killed himself in prison last year," Eleanor continued. "But not before you told me all about the original plan, how Brightline was to be systematically devalued for a future acquisition, how my brother needed to be silenced. I never—" "You may not have pulled the trigger, Carson, but you're following the same playbook now. Same methods, same dirty tactics." She stood up, approaching him. "The only difference is that this time, someone was watching." The wind blew harder, carrying dry leaves around them in an orange swirl. Tourists took photos of the fountain, oblivious to the drama unfolding in their midst. "What happened to the documents?" Carson asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "They are safe, as is the evidence I have collected about their recent activities." Eleanor adjusted the strap of her bag. "You still have 24 hours, Carson. Save Brightline, or everything comes to light. Not just your actions, but the entire sordid story that led up to here." She started to walk away, but Carson grabbed her arm. "Why work as my housekeeper? Why not just report me?" Eleanor gently released his grip, her green eyes fixed on his. "Because some people need to understand the real price of their actions. They need to see up close the lives they affect with their decisions made from the top of their ivory towers." When she disappeared into the crowd, Carson remained still, watching the fountain's water dance in the afternoon light. Her empire was threatened, her reputation hanging by a thread, and yet she couldn't help but admire the determination and intelligence of the woman who had planned it all. Picking up his phone, he dialed his lawyer's number. He had important decisions to make, and time was running out. As he waited for the call to connect, Carson realized that, for the first time in his life, he wasn't just thinking about numbers and profits. He was thinking about the people behind them. The law firm Winters & Associates occupied 3 entire floors of an Art Deco building on Park Avenue. Carson watched the city through the boardroom windows while Howard Winters, his lawyer for 2 decades, examined the documents spread out on the mahogany desk. "This is more serious than we thought, Carson," Howard said, removing his reading glasses. "If Eleanor Banks, or Catherine Price, really has the evidence she claims to have, we're not just talking about a corporate scandal. We're potentially dealing with complicity in murder." "I had no knowledge of Michael Price's death," Carson protested, his voice strained. "Benjamin never mentioned." "But you knew about the plans to devalue Brightline," Howard interrupted. "And now it's following the same script. Federal prosecutors are going to have a field day connecting the dots." Carson sank into one of the leather chairs, feeling the weight of his past decisions. The connection with Benjamin Walsh, which once seemed like an asset in his career, now threatened to become his biggest nightmare. "What are our options?" Howard organized the papers into a neat pile before responding. "Legally, we can try to discredit Eleanor, expose her false identity, question her motivations. But if she really has incriminating documents—" "She does," Carson stated, remembering the certainty in Eleanor's eyes during their encounter in the park. "And something tells me that every move we make against her has already been anticipated." "Then we only have one option left," Howard concluded. "You need to do exactly as she asks. Cancel the Brightline acquisition." Carson's phone vibrated. A message from Rebecca that Brightline representatives had arrived for the afternoon meeting. He checked his Patek Philippe, the same watch Eleanor had used as a pretext for their first confrontation. 15 minutes to reset your unflappable CEO mask. Schedule a press conference for tomorrow, Carson instructed Howard as he adjusted his tie. We will announce the withdrawal of the acquisition. As the elevator descended to the conference room on the 38th floor, Carson reflected on how his life had changed in just 48 hours. Eleanor's presence had awakened something he had long buried, a consciousness that corporate success had silenced. The meeting with Brightline executives went surprisingly smoothly. The announcement that Montgomery Industries was reconsidering the acquisition was met with visible relief by company representatives. Carson watched their faces, wondering how many of them knew Catherine Price, how many had worked with Michael. Back at his penthouse that night, Carson found an envelope on his work desk. Inside, a single photograph. Himself, younger, at a gala dinner alongside Benjamin Walsh. On the back, Eleanor's elegant handwriting. Choices define who we are. You can still choose to be better. Pouring himself a whiskey, Carson walked out onto the porch. The city glowed beneath the night sky, millions of lights representing millions of lives, lives that your corporate decisions directly affected. Impressive view, isn't it? Carson turned sharply. Eleanor stood at the entrance to the porch, still wearing her governess's uniform, but her posture revealed the woman behind the disguise. Like you. I still have the keys, she smiled, moving closer to lean on the railing. And I needed to make sure you got the message. Why didn't you seek justice directly? Carson asked, studying his profile against the city lights. Why all this elaborate revenge? Eleanor turned to face him, her green eyes reflecting the lights of Manhattan. Because justice without understanding is just punishment. I needed you to understand the true cost of your actions, not just to Brightline, but to every person affected by decisions made in boardrooms like yours. What now? After I cancel the acquisition? Now you have a choice, Eleanor replied, taking a flash drive out of her pocket. Here's everything I have on you and Benjamin Walsh. Use it however you want. Carson picked up the device, feeling its insignificant weight in his hands. Why are you giving me this? Because I believe you are not Benjamin, she said softly. You can still choose a different path. The question is, do you want to? Before Carson could respond, Eleanor had already disappeared into the apartment. The sound of your footsteps echoed through the hallway, followed by the soft click of the door closing. Carson stood on the porch for a long time, flash drive in one hand and glass of whiskey in the other, pondering choices and consequences. Tomorrow he would face the press and announce a decision that would change the course of his company. But that night, under the stars of Manhattan, he was more concerned with a different decision, what kind of man he wanted to be from now on. The press conference was announced for 10 a.m. in the Montgomery Industries main auditorium. Carson adjusted his tie for the third time as Rebecca finalized the last details of her speech. The main financial media outlets already occupied the front rows, their cameras and microphones pointed at the empty stage like weapons ready to fire. The takeover cancellation documents are ready for signature, Rebecca reported, her voice betraying a restrained curiosity about the sudden change of plans. The legal department reviewed everything 3 times. Carson nodded absently, his eyes fixed on the flash drive Eleanor had given him the night before. The small device sat heavy in his pocket like a moral anchor, constantly reminding him of the choices that had brought him here. Mr. Montgomery? Marcus Chen appeared in the preparation room, his normally serene face marked by lines of worry. Our investors in Singapore are demanding explanations. This sudden change in strategy. Tell them to trust the process, Marcus, Carson interrupted, his voice firmer than he felt. Sometimes the best deal is the one we decide not to make. As he walked toward the stage, Carson felt the weight of the eyes on him. Journalists, shareholders, board members, all waiting for an explanation that could justify the apparent abandonment of months of strategic planning. Good morning, everyone, he began, flashlights dancing in his peripheral vision. Montgomery Industries has always prided itself on making decisions based not just on numbers, but also on principles. After an extensive reevaluation, we have decided to withdraw our offer to acquire Brightline Technologies. A murmur ran through the auditorium. Carson saw expressions of shock, confusion, and, on some faces, something that looked like relief. At the back of the room, a familiar figure caught his attention. Eleanor, dressed in a discreet business suit, observed everything with an enigmatic half-smile. This decision was not made lightly, he continued, looking away from her. We believe Brightline Technologies has greater value as an independent entity, continuing its mission of innovation and preserving the jobs of its dedicated employees. The questions came like an avalanche. Why the sudden change? What is the impact on shareholders? Was there regulatory pressure? Carson responded to each with studied calm, converting years of experience into answers that satisfied without revealing too much. After the press conference, as journalists dispersed and executives gathered in whispering groups, Eleanor approached her desk on the stage. "Impressive performance," she commented, discreetly adjusting some papers on the wooden surface. "I almost believed every word." "Maybe because some of it is true," Carson replied, keeping his voice low. "You changed something about me, Eleanor. Or maybe you just reminded me of who I used to be." "And who was that?" "Someone who cared about more than numbers on a spreadsheet." He faced her directly. "Someone your brother might have respected." A shadow of emotion crossed Eleanor's face, but it was quickly replaced by her usual composure. "What do you want to do with the information I gave you?" Carson took the flash drive out of his pocket, twirling it between his fingers. "I haven't decided yet, but I have some ideas about how to use this to do the right thing." "The right thing," Eleanor repeated, a touch of bitterness in her voice. "Do you know this can destroy careers? Including yours?" "Some things need to be destroyed to be rebuilt," he replied, surprising himself with his own conviction. The room was almost empty now, just a few cleaning staff arranging the chairs. Eleanor moved closer, her soft scent mixing with the air conditioning. "Have dinner with me tonight," Carson suddenly suggested. "Not as CEO and housekeeper, not as antagonists, just as two people who perhaps have more in common than they realized." Eleanor studied his face for a moment that seemed to stretch on forever. "The River Cafe, Brooklyn Heights, 8 p.m., she finally replied. "This time I make the reservation under my real name." As she turned to leave, Carson called out to her, "Catherine?" She stopped, but didn't turn around. "Your brother would be proud of what you did." Eleanor, Catherine, remained still for a moment, her shoulders tense beneath her well-cut blazer. When he finally turned around, there were unshed tears in his eyes. "Maybe," she said softly, "he would be proud of both of us." The rest of the day passed in a blur of emergency meetings and phone calls with worried investors. But Carson's mind kept returning to that moment of shared vulnerability, to the promise of a dinner that could mark not just the end of revenge, but the beginning of something unexpected. At 7:45 p.m., his driver dropped him off near the Brooklyn Bridge. The short walk to the restaurant offered a stunning view of the Manhattan skyline, the city lights reflecting off the waters of the East River like fallen stars. Carson thought about how those same lights had witnessed so many stories of power, revenge, and redemption over the years. Now, walking towards the River Cafe, he wondered what kind of story his was about to become. The River Cafe shone like a jewel set into the bank of the East River, its panoramic windows offering a spectacular view of the city that never sleeps. Catherine was already sitting at a table by the window when Carson arrived, her navy blue dress reflecting the dancing lights of the water. "On time again," she observed, indicating the chair in front of her. "Some things never change." "And others change completely," Carson replied, sitting down and noticing how different she looked away from the constraints of her role as Eleanor. "Catherine suits you better than Eleanor." A genuine smile appeared on her lips. 5 years of playing different roles. It feels good to finally use my real name. The sommelier approached with the wine list, but Catherine had already made her choice, a Pinot Noir from the Willamette Valley region. Carson couldn't help but admire how every detail of her performance as housekeeper had been meticulously planned, including her seemingly casual knowledge of wine. "So," he began after the first sip. "Harvard? Class of 2012, she confirmed. "Michael and I were always ambitious. He went into finance, I into strategic consulting. We were the pride of a middle-class family from Providence, Rhode Island. How did you find out about Benjamin?" Catherine twirled the glass between her fingers, watching the wine dance. Michael began noticing discrepancies in Brightline's books about 6 months before the end. Small irregularities that, when added together, formed a disturbing pattern. When he dug deeper, he discovered a network of shell companies and suspicious transfers. The waiter brought the main dishes, grilled sea bass for her, lamb for him. The delicate aroma of the dishes contrasted with the gravity of the conversation. Benjamin was preparing the company for bankruptcy, Catherine continued, her voice low but firm. Michael discovered it was part of a larger plan, to devalue Brightline to facilitate a future acquisition. When he threatened to expose everything. "Catherine," Carson interrupted softly, "I didn't really know about Michael. Benjamin never mentioned—" "But you knew the general plan," she added. "You were the intended final buyer, even if it was 5 years later. Same strategy, same result. Only this time, I was watching." Silence fell between them, filled only by the soft clink of silverware and the distant murmur of other conversations. Through the window, Manhattan shone like a distant dream, its lights reflecting off the dark waters of the river. "Why give me the evidence?" Carson finally asked. "Why not use everything to completely destroy me?" Catherine set down the silverware, her green eyes meeting his with a disconcerting intensity. "Because during these 3 months, watching you closely, I saw something Benjamin never had. Conscience. You may have followed his playbook, but there was hesitation in your decisions, doubt in your eyes when you read reports about mass layoffs. And now? Now it's up to you," she replied. "That flash drive contains not only evidence about your involvement, but the entire history of Brightline, including—" she hesitated briefly, "evidence about what really happened to Michael." Carson felt the weight of that revelation. "You want me to turn everything over to the authorities." "I want you to make the right choice," Catherine corrected. "Not for me, not for fear of exposure, but because that's what Michael would have done." Dinner continued with unexpected intimacy, their conversations drifting to lighter topics, Harvard memories, favorite books, places they dreamed of visiting. It was as if, freed from the weight of their previous roles, they could finally see themselves as they truly were. When dessert arrived, a chocolate soufflé that they decided to share, Carson realized he was seeing Catherine in a completely new way. Not as a threat or an avenger, but as someone who had sacrificed years of her life for justice and principle. "You know what's ironic?" she commented, enjoying a spoonful of the soufflé. "All this time planning my revenge, I never imagined it could end like this, sharing a dessert with the man I set out to destroy." "Life has a peculiar sense of humor," Carson smiled, noticing how her smile lit up her eyes in a way he'd never noticed before. "What now? What does Catherine Price plan to do after this is all over?" "Honestly, I don't know. I spent so much time being other people that I almost forgot who I was." "Maybe," Carson suggested, his heart quickening slightly, "we can figure it out together." Catherine studied him for a long moment, as if trying to read the truth behind his words. "Are you suggesting a partnership?" "I'm suggesting a fresh start," he replied. "For both of us." Outside, the city continued its nightly ballet of lights and shadows, indifferent to the dramas unfolding on its banks. But inside the River Café, something was changing. A story of revenge turning, unexpectedly, into something very different. "A fresh start," Catherine repeated softly, a smile appearing on her lips. I think I can work with that. The morning after dinner at the River Cafe brought with it a clarity that Carson hadn't experienced in years. In his office at Montgomery Industries, he studied the files on the flash drive that Catherine had given him, each document revealing more layers of the intricate web of deceptions that Benjamin Walsh had woven. "Mr. Montgomery?" Rebecca broke her concentration. "Miss Price is here to see you." Catherine entered the room wearing a charcoal gray business suit that made her look even more distant from housekeeper Eleanor Banks. Her heels echoed softly on the marble floor as she approached Carson's desk. "I see you've started the review," she commented, noticing the document spread out on the glass surface. "It's worse than we imagined," Carson replied, indicating a chair. Benjamin was not just preparing Brightline for a hostile takeover. He was systematically diverting funds through a network of shell companies in Cayman. Catherine nodded, her green eyes fixed on the papers. Michael found out about this 3 days before he died. He had just scheduled a meeting with the FBI when someone silenced him, Carson added softly. "Catherine, these documents implicate very powerful people. Not just Benjamin, but council members, politicians, judges. That's why I'm here," she replied, leaning forward. "We need a plan. If we're going to expose all of this, we need to do it the right way." The desk intercom buzzed. "Mr. Montgomery, Mr. Richardson from the SEC is on line 1. Carson and Catherine exchanged glances. The Securities and Exchange Commission was already moving, likely in response to the sudden cancellation of the Brightline acquisition. "Put it on hold," Carson instructed before turning his attention to Catherine. "How long do you think we have before they start making the right connections?" "Days, maybe hours," she replied. "The patterns are obvious to anyone who knows where to look. And after your announcement yesterday, everyone is looking." Carson stood up, walking to the window that offered a panoramic view of Manhattan. The morning sun reflected off the skyscrapers like thousands of spotlights, illuminating a city that held as many secrets as the people who inhabited it. "We need help," he decided, turning to face her. "Someone with experience in corporate fraud cases and connections to federal authorities." "Are you thinking of anyone specific?" "Alexandra Winters," Carson replied. "Former federal prosecutor, now a partner in her own law firm. She prosecuted Benjamin years ago in another case, but never got enough evidence." Catherine considered the suggestion for a moment. "Can we trust her?" "She's the only person I know who hates corporate corruption more than you do," Carson smiled slightly. "And it has the resources necessary to protect us when everything blows up." The phone rang again, more insistent this time. The world outside wouldn't wait forever. "Make an appointment for lunch," Catherine decided, standing up. "Today. The sooner we start, the better." As she headed for the door, Carson called out to her, "Catherine?" She stopped, partially turning around. "About last night. I meant what I said, about starting over." A small smile appeared on her lips. "First, let's bring justice to Michael. Then we can talk about new beginnings." Le Cirque was chosen for lunch, its discreet atmosphere and exclusive clientele offering the necessary privacy for such a delicate conversation. Alexandra Winters was already waiting for them at a reserved table at the back of the restaurant, her impeccable Chanel suit contrasting with the intensity of her gaze. "Carson Montgomery asking for my help," she commented once they sat down. "The world really does take interesting turns." "Alexandra," Carson began, but she stopped him with a gesture. "Before we continue, I need to know exactly where I'm standing, and who," she looked directly at Catherine, "is your mysterious companion." "Catherine Price," Catherine introduced herself, holding the lawyer's gaze. "Michael Price's sister." Recognition flashed in Alexandra's eyes. The Brightline CFO who allegedly committed suicide. She leaned back in her chair, studying the two of them. Now things get interesting. Over the next 2 hours, between French haute cuisine and coded conversations for curious ears, a plan began to take shape. Alexandra listened intently as Catherine and Carson detailed the evidence they had, occasionally making notes in a small leather notebook. You have a solid case, she finally declared. But we need to act fast. As soon as we start moving the pieces, powerful people will try to stop us. How long? Carson asked. Give me 48 hours to prepare the necessary documentation and make some discreet contacts at the FBI, Alexandra replied. After that, everything will happen very quickly. When they left the restaurant, the afternoon sun was already beginning its descent over Manhattan, painting the buildings with golden tones. Carson and Catherine walked in silence for a few blocks, each lost in their own thoughts. Are you prepared for what lies ahead? Carson finally asked, stopping on a busy corner. Catherine looked around at the city, at the people rushing about their daily routines, oblivious to the drama that was about to unfold. I've spent 5 years preparing for this moment. The question is, are you? Carson's response was interrupted by the sound of his cell phone. A text message flashed on the screen. Emergency board meeting called for early tomorrow. Subject, irregularities in attempted takeover of Brightline. The game was starting, and time was running out. The Montgomery Industries boardroom emanated tension when Carson walked in the next morning. 12 familiar faces watched him with expressions ranging from concern to barely concealed hostility. At the opposite head of the table, Gerald Blackburn, the chairman of the board, drummed his fingers on the polished mahogany surface. Carson, Gerald began, his voice calculatedly neutral. I imagine you know why we called this emergency meeting. Enlighten me, Gerald, Carson replied, maintaining a casual tone as he sat down. His phone vibrated discreetly in his pocket. A message from Catherine. Alexandra is on her way to the FBI. Keep them busy. We have received troubling information regarding your decision to cancel the Brightline acquisition, Gerald continued, specifically about possible personal motivations involved. Carson noticed the looks exchanged between the council members. Someone had started to connect the dots, but how much did they really know? Personal motivations? Carson raised an eyebrow. My only motivation was to protect the interests of Montgomery Industries. And even? Patricia Morrison, a board veteran known for her sharp tongue, leaned forward. So perhaps you could explain to us your recent meetings with Catherine Price? The name fell like a bomb in the room. Carson kept his expression impassive, but his mind worked furiously. How did they find out? Catherine Price. Gerald repeated the name slowly. Sister of Michael Price, former CFO of Brightline. The same Michael Price who died under mysterious circumstances 5 years ago, shortly after threatening to expose alleged wrongdoing at the company. You guys have been doing your homework, Carson commented, biding his time as he formulated his strategy. Actually, Patricia interjected, it was your housekeeper who helped us. Eleanor Banks, or should I say Catherine Price herself. Carson felt a pang of admiration for the way Catherine had handled the situation. Even his exposure had been calculated to take place at exactly this moment. Gentlemen, Carson stood, walking to the window that dominated the east wall of the room. You are right. I have been meeting with Catherine Price, and what I learned has convinced me that the acquisition of Brightline would be a catastrophic mistake. Who's wrong, Carson? Gerald asked. For Montgomery Industries or for the people you're trying to protect? For all of us. Carson turned, facing each council member. Do you really want to know why I called off the acquisition? Because I discovered we were about to buy a company built on fraud, embezzlement, and possibly murder. The silence that followed his statement was deafening. Carson could practically see the gears turning in the counselors' minds, calculating risks and implications. His phone vibrated again. FBI entering building. Keep them in the room. Indeed, Carson continued. Right now, evidence is being turned over to the FBI detailing a conspiracy that extends far beyond Brightline. A conspiracy that began with Benjamin Walsh, but which has ramifications that reach into this very room. Gerald stood up abruptly. This meeting is adjourned. Carson, you are temporarily relieved of your duties as CEO. The sound of doors opening interrupted him. Federal agents entered the room, led by a determined-looking Alexandra Winters. "Actually, Mr. Blackburn, no one is leaving this room," Alexandra announced, producing a court order. "We have some questions about your connections to Benjamin Walsh and certain offshore transactions." The next few minutes were a whirlwind of activity. As agents began collecting documents and electronic equipment, Carson watched the empire he had helped build begin its transformation. His phone vibrated one last time. "Meet me at our place when you're done." 2 hours later, Carson pushed open the door of the River Cafe, finding Catherine sitting in the same spot as the night before. The afternoon sun painted the East River with golden hues, creating a dramatic contrast to the chaos they had unleashed. "How was it?" she asked when he sat down. "Exactly as we planned," Carson replied, loosening his tie. "Gerald and Patricia were the first to be taken in for questioning. The others are cooperating, trying to make deals. And you?" "Alexandra granted my immunity in exchange for full cooperation." He smiled lightly. "Apparently, voluntarily exposing a billion-dollar conspiracy counts for points with the FBI." Catherine nodded, her green eyes reflecting a mixture of satisfaction and melancholy. "Michael always said the truth had a way of coming out. He just didn't live to see this day." "But you accomplished what he started." Carson reached across the table, gently touching her fingers, "and in the process, saved us all from becoming just like Benjamin." Her touch was warm, alive, so different from Eleanor Banks's calculated coldness. "So," she laced her fingers through his, "about that fresh start you mentioned." Alexandra Winters' office was buzzing with activity the next morning. Assistants ran through the halls carrying stacks of documents, while FBI agents occupied makeshift conference rooms. In the center of this whirlwind, Carson and Catherine reviewed statements with the lawyer. "The first indictments will be announced this afternoon," Alexandra reported, spreading files out on her mahogany desk. "Gerald Blackburn is negotiating a plea deal. Apparently he has a lot to say about Benjamin Walsh and his political connections." Catherine leafed through a particularly voluminous dossier, her fingers occasionally stopping at specific passages. "He mentioned something about the night Michael." "Not yet," Alexandra interrupted gently. "But with the pressure mounting, it's only a matter of time before someone speaks out." Carson observed Catherine discreetly, noting how she maintained her professional composure, even when faced with details about her brother's death. It was a strength he had begun to admire more and more over the past few days. "I got an interesting call this morning," Alexandra continued, pouring herself some coffee. "Benjamin Walsh's widow wants to talk." The name made Carson and Catherine exchange meaningful glances. Margaret Walsh had remained a recluse since her husband's suicide in prison, avoiding any contact with the press or investigators. "What could she want after all this time?" Carson asked. "She claims to have information," Alexandra replied, "about the night Michael died, and about certain transactions that Benjamin carried out in the preceding days." Catherine stood up abruptly, walking to the window that offered a view of Central Park. Autumn painted the trees in shades of red and gold, a beauty that contrasted with the tension in the environment. "When?" she asked without turning around. "This afternoon." She asked to meet her at her home in Greenwich, Connecticut. Carson moved closer to Catherine, not touching her, but close enough to offer silent support. "You don't have to go." "Yes, I do," she replied, finally turning around. Her green eyes met his with determination. I need to look into her eyes and find out how much she knew. The journey to Greenwich was made in contemplative silence. Carson drove his Mercedes through the autumn landscape of Connecticut, occasionally casting worried glances at Catherine in the passenger seat. Alexandra followed them in her own car, accompanied by 2 federal agents. The Walsh mansion was a stately Georgian-style estate surrounded by meticulously maintained gardens. Margaret Walsh was waiting for them in the library, an elegant woman in her 60s, dressed entirely in black as if still in mourning. "Miss Price," Margaret greeted as they entered, her voice surprisingly soft. "You have your brother's eyes." Catherine remained impassive, but Carson noticed her slight shudder at the mention of Michael. "Why did you call us, Mrs. Walsh?" Alexandra interjected, assuming her professional role. Margaret walked over to an antique oak desk, removing a key from a drawer. "Benjamin kept a secret safe in his home office. After his death, I found this." She held out a yellowed envelope. Catherine took the envelope with slightly shaking hands. Inside, he found photographs and a flash drive. "Benjamin was not a good man," Margaret continued, pouring herself a drink. "I knew of his business indiscretions, but I never imagined he would be able to—" His voice trailed off. "Able to order my brother's murder?" Catherine added, her voice cutting like ice. "He didn't give the order directly," Margaret replied, staring into her glass. "But he created the circumstances that led to this. Gerald Blackburn was the one who really—" Carson felt Catherine stiffen beside him. The revelation hung in the air like poisonous smoke. "Do we have recordings?" Alexandra asked, already in investigative mode. "Everything is on the flash drive," Margaret confirmed, including conversations between Benjamin and Gerald in the days before and after Michael's death. Benjamin recorded all their important conversations. It was his safe. The next few hours were dedicated to reviewing the contents of the flash drive. Alexandra and FBI agents turned the Walsh Library into a makeshift command center, while Carson and Catherine processed the revelations that emerged. "We need a moment," Carson announced when the tension became too palpable. He led Catherine to the gardens, where the cool autumn air offered some relief. They walked in silence until they found a stone bench overlooking a small, ornamental lake. 5 years, Catherine finally spoke, her voice breaking. 5 years of searching for answers, and they were here the whole time. Carson hesitated before taking her hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. "You did it, Catherine. You got justice for Michael." She turned to him, unshed tears shining in her eyes. "And I lost 5 years of my life in the process. I turned into other people. I abandoned who I was." "Maybe," Carson suggested softly, "now is the time to rediscover Catherine Price." The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange that were reflected on the placid surface of the lake. Amid the chaos of investigations and revelations, that moment offered a pause, a chance to breathe and contemplate the future. "What if I don't know who she is anymore?" Catherine asked, her vulnerability evident in her voice. Carson brought her hand to his lips, gently kissing her fingers. "Then we'll find out together." The morning sun found Carson and Catherine on the roof of the Chrysler Building, one of the few places in Manhattan where they could freely discuss the events of the last few days. Margaret Walsh's testimony had set in motion a series of events that now dominated the headlines of every financial newspaper. "Gerald Blackburn has accepted the plea deal," Catherine reported, passing her tablet to Carson. "He will testify about Benjamin's involvement in Michael's murder in exchange for a reduced sentence." Carson looked over the document, noticing how his hands were shaking slightly. The fall of Montgomery Industries was affecting him more than he cared to admit. "How long do you think he'll get?" "Alexandra estimates between 15 and 20 years old," Catherine replied, approaching the railing. The city stretched out below them, seemingly unchanged despite the earthquake shaking the corporate world. But the real punishment will be public exposure, the prestige he so cherished. "It's over," Carson added, joining her. "Just like mine." Catherine turned to face him, her green eyes studying his profile. "You made the right choice, Carson. Few men in your position would have that courage." "It wasn't courage," he replied softly. "It was you. You made me see beyond numbers, beyond power. Even when I was Eleanor Banks, there was something in her eyes that challenged me to be better." The wind ruffled Catherine's hair, and Carson resisted the urge to touch it. Their relationship had evolved into something complex and indefinable, a mix of complicity, attraction, and mutual respect that neither was ready to name. Catherine's phone vibrated, interrupting the moment. Alexandra wants to meet us in her office. Apparently they found something in Benjamin's personal files. Alexandra Winter's office was even more chaotic than usual. Stacks of documents covered every available surface, and assistants ran back and forth with tense expressions. "You guys need to see this." Alexandra led them to a private conference room. On the table, a series of old photographs were arranged in chronological order. These were found in a secret compartment in the Walsh's beach house in Hampton. Catherine picked up one of the photos, her face visibly paling. This is from Michael's Harvard graduation. Was Benjamin there?" "Not just there." Alexandra pointed to other photographs. "He had been watching his brother for years, long before Michael started working at Brightline." Carson studied the images, feeling an uncomfortable shiver. Benjamin Walsh appeared in the background of several photographs of the Price family, at graduations, family parties, even at the funeral of Catherine and Michael's parents. "That doesn't make sense," Catherine muttered, sinking into a chair. "Why would he be watching us for so long?" Alexandra removed a manila envelope from her briefcase. "Because Benjamin Walsh was his biological father." The silence that followed the revelation was deafening. Catherine stood completely still, her eyes fixed on the photographs as if they could belie the newly revealed truth. "We found the DNA tests among the documents," Alexandra continued gently. "Apparently Benjamin had an affair with your mother before she got married. When she found out about the pregnancy, she chose to raise you and Michael with James Price." Carson watched Catherine process the information, her mind surely reliving every moment of her life in this new light. He wanted to touch her, comfort her, but he knew she needed this moment for herself. "So Michael found out," Catherine finally spoke, her voice thick with painful understanding. "It wasn't just about the fraud at Brightline. He discovered the truth about Benjamin. And Benjamin couldn't allow that to come to light," Alexandra confirmed. "His reputation, his marriage to Margaret, his entire empire was at risk." Catherine stood up abruptly, walking to the window. The afternoon was beginning to fall over New York, shadows stretching between the buildings like dark fingers reaching up to the sky. "Are you okay?" Carson asked softly, approaching her. "No," she replied with surprising honesty. "But I'm staying. Michael deserves me to finish what he started, regardless of who our biological father was." Carson hesitated before touching his shoulder. "You're not alone in this." Catherine covered his hand with hers, a simple gesture that carried the weight of all the unspoken words between them. "I know." Alexandra cleared her throat discreetly. "There's one more thing you need to know. Margaret Walsh is willing to testify about everything. Benjamin's relationship with his mother, the surveillance over the years, even the conversations she overheard about the night Michael died." "Why?" Catherine questioned, turning around. "Why now?" "Maybe," Carson suggested, "she's seeking redemption too." The rest of the afternoon was dedicated to reviewing documents and preparing strategies with the legal team. When they finally left the office, night had already fallen over the city, transforming Manhattan into a kaleidoscope of lights and shadows. "Dinner?" Carson offered as they walked down Park Avenue. Catherine considered it for a moment before nodding. "I think we need something stronger than food today." "I know the perfect place," he smiled, guiding her toward the Campbell, the historic Art Deco bar in Grand Central Terminal. The Campbell seemed frozen in time, its Art Deco ambience transporting visitors to a more elegant era. Carson and Catherine found a discreet corner near the polished mahogany bar, where soft lighting created an intimate atmosphere ripe for difficult conversations. "Extra dry martini for the lady," the bartender served Catherine, "and bourbon on the rocks for the gentleman." Catherine twirled the glass between her fingers, watching the lone olive dance in the crystal-clear liquid. "Did you know Michael used to bring me here? He said it was the only place in New York where he could really think." "And now we know why Benjamin always seemed to know where to find him," Carson commented softly, studying the amber reflection of his bourbon. "It's strange," Catherine continued, her voice low but firm. I spent 5 years planning my revenge against the man I believed was responsible for my brother's death, only to discover that he was—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "He wasn't your father," Carson stated with conviction. "James Price was the one who raised you and Michael, who loved and protected you. Benjamin Walsh was just a DNA donor who became a killer." Catherine met his eyes, gratitude evident in her gaze. "How do you do that?" "What?" "Saying exactly what I need to hear, even when I don't even know what it is." Carson smiled slightly, leaning closer. "Maybe because after all these months of watching Eleanor Banks, I've learned to see the real Catherine Price." The moment was interrupted by Carson's phone. A message from Alexandra flashed on the screen. "Press conference scheduled for tomorrow 10 a.m. Margaret Walsh will confess everything." "Are you ready for this?" Carson asked, showing the message to Catherine. "Once Margaret speaks out publicly, there will be no going back." "I've been ready since the day I found Michael," Catherine replied, her determination returning. "But you? Your reputation?" "My reputation was built on lies and omissions," Carson interrupted. "Maybe it's time to build something new, something true." The bartender brought a second round of drinks, and they silently toasted the uncertain future that awaited them. The night wore on, and the bar gradually emptied, leaving them in a bubble of increasingly dense intimacy. "You know what's ironic?" Catherine commented after a long silence. "When I went undercover as Eleanor Banks, I was convinced you were just like Benjamin. Cold, calculating, willing to sacrifice anyone for profit. And what changed?" "You," she replied simply. "The way he treated his employees when he thought no one was watching. The little hesitations before making difficult decisions. The way his hands shook slightly when signing documents that would result in dismissals." Carson felt his heart quicken at the intimacy of those remarks. "You saw me even when I tried to be invisible. Just as you saw me through Eleanor's disguise," Catherine added softly. The surrounding environment seemed to have disappeared, leaving just the two of them in their own private universe. The smooth jazz music playing in the background created a perfect soundtrack for the moment of shared vulnerability. "Catherine," Carson began, his voice hoarse with suppressed emotion, "when this is all over—" "No," she interrupted him gently, placing a finger on his lips. "Let's not make promises now. Not while there are still so many truths to be revealed." He gently kissed the tip of her finger before she removed it. "Then promise me just this, that when the dust settles, we will have this conversation again." "That I can promise," she smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her green eyes. By the time they left the Campbell, night had enveloped Manhattan in its dark cloak, punctuated only by the city's eternal lights. Carson insisted on accompanying Catherine to her West Village apartment, a modest location that contrasted sharply with the luxurious penthouse where she had worked as Eleanor. "Tomorrow," Catherine said as she fumbled for her keys, "everything changes." "Everything has already changed," Carson replied, resisting the urge to touch her. "But maybe it's for the better." She hesitated at the door, as if she wanted to say something more, but only nodded slightly before disappearing into the building. Carson stood on the sidewalk for a moment, watching the light in her third-floor apartment come on. His phone vibrated again. Another message from Alexandra. "Press leak. Story will explode before the press conference. Get ready." Carson took one last look at the bright window before leaving. The night was just beginning, and dawn promised to bring with it a storm of revelations that would forever change Manhattan's corporate landscape and their lives. The first light of morning had not yet touched the Manhattan skyline when Catherine was awakened by the insistent ringing of her phone. The screen showed multiple notifications from different media outlets, all with variations of the same explosive headline: "Secret Brightline Heiress Exposes Corporate Conspiracy." As he scrolled through the news, his phone buzzed with a message from Carson. "CNN live in 5 minutes. Turn on the TV." Catherine turned on her television in time to see Margaret Walsh, impeccably dressed in a gray suit, sitting next to a national anchor. His face, normally a mask of aristocratic composure, showed visible signs of tension. Ms. Walsh, the anchor began, you are here today to make an extraordinary revelation about your late husband, Benjamin Walsh, and his connection to the Price family. Can you tell us more about that? Margaret slightly adjusted her pearl necklace before answering. Benjamin kept a secret for more than 3 decades. He had 2 children he never acknowledged publicly, Catherine and Michael Price. Catherine's phone exploded with messages and calls, but she kept her eyes fixed on the screen, watching as Margaret unfolded the story that had been kept secret for so long. Carson, she typed quickly, we need to meet. Now. I'm on my way, was his immediate reply. 20 minutes later, Carson arrived at Catherine's apartment, carrying still warm coffee and bagels. She opened the door still wearing her navy blue silk robe, her normally flawless hair slightly disheveled. The press is camped out in front of my building, he reported, placing his coffee on the kitchen table. Alexandra is organizing a press conference to control the narrative, but the damage is already done, Catherine added, picking up one of the coffee cups. Did you see the interview? See? Carson nodded, watching as she moved around the small kitchen with a natural grace that Eleanor Banks never demonstrated. Margaret spared no details, the part about Benjamin orchestrating his own admission to Brightline. So you can watch me closely, Catherine added bitterly. All this time he was there, watching, manipulating our lives like a sick puppet master. Carson approached her, gently touching her shoulder. But he couldn't control the ending of this story. You made sure of that. The moment was interrupted by the ringing of the doorbell. Through the peephole, Catherine saw Alexandra Winters, looking even more serious than usual. We have a problem, the lawyer announced as she entered. Gerald Blackburn is dead. The silence that followed the declaration was as heavy as lead. Catherine plopped down on the couch, while Carson began pacing the room. How? He finally asked. Apparently suicide, Alexandra replied, removing a folder from her bag. But he left a letter confessing everything. His part in Michael's death, the scheme with Benjamin, even details about other illegal operations that we didn't know about. Catherine took the folder with shaking hands, her eyes running over the typed pages. That seems too convenient. My thoughts exactly, Alexandra agreed. Especially considering he had just signed a plea agreement. Why kill himself now? Carson approached the window, watching the city as it began to awaken. Someone didn't want him to testify. Someone with more to lose than Benjamin or Margaret. But who? Catherine asked, leafing through more documents in the folder. Benjamin is dead, Gerald is dead, Margaret is cooperating. The advice, Carson turned abruptly. Not just Montgomery Industries or Brightline, but the entire network of interconnected companies. Gerald knew all the schemes, all the connections. Alexandra was already on the phone, giving quick instructions to her team. We need to protect Margaret, if they got to Gerald. She's safe, Carson assured her. I moved her to a private property in Vermont last night with 24-hour security. Catherine watched the interaction between the two, a sudden realization hitting her. You knew this would happen. I suspected, Carson admitted. I've known these men for years, Catherine. I know what they're capable of when they feel cornered. The rest of the morning was a whirlwind of activity. Alexandra coordinated with the FBI, while Carson and Catherine prepared for the inevitable coming media storm. You need a safe place too, Carson insisted as Catherine packed a small suitcase. My house in Hampton. No, she interrupted him firmly. I'm not going to hide. Michael didn't hide, and look what happened to him. It's time to face this head on. Carson watched her for a moment, admiring her strength even in the midst of chaos. Then let's face it together. Catherine stopped folding a blouse, turning to face him. Why? Why are you still by my side even after everything I've done? Because, Carson reached out, gently touching her face. You showed me that there is still redemption, even for someone like me. The moment between them was charged with unresolved electricity, years of secrets and lies finally giving way to a raw, honest truth. Alexandra's phone interrupted the moment. They found something in Gerald's apartment. You guys need to see it. Gerald Blackburn's apartment was a monument to corporate power, occupying an entire floor of the Plaza private residences. When Carson and Catherine arrived, accompanied by Alexandra and 2 FBI agents, the place was already packed with investigators collecting evidence. This way, Alexandra led them into the main office, where an entire wall had been revealed behind a revolving bookshelf. Gerald kept a secret archive, decades of corporate secrets, all meticulously catalogued. Catherine looked through the chronologically organized folders, her fingers stopping at one marked Price, 1989. Inside, he found photographs of his mother with Benjamin Walsh, letters never sent, and a document that made his heart stop. "Carson," she called, her voice shaking slightly. "Look at this." It was a contract, dated 3 months before Catherine's birth, where Benjamin agreed to pay a significant sum to James Price to assume paternity of his unborn child. His mother's signature was at the bottom of the page, along with a handwritten note from Benjamin. "The empire needs a legitimate heir." "He planned it all," Carson murmured, reading over Catherine's shoulder. "From the beginning." "Not just that," Alexandra interjected, holding up another document. "Gerald was the lawyer who drew up the contract. He knew everything all along." Catherine staggered slightly and Carson supported her, guiding her to a leather armchair. The weight of the revelations seemed to crush the air in the room. "There's more," one of the FBI agents approached, carrying a laptop. "We found emails exchanged between Gerald and other board members in the last 24 hours before his death. The messages revealed a desperate plan to silence all witnesses who could expose the true extent of the conspiracy. Gerald had not committed suicide. He had been silenced by his own colleagues. "We need protection for everyone involved." Alexandra was already on the phone with her team. "And we need to act quickly. If they got to Gerald..." "They'll come after me," Catherine added, her voice surprisingly firm. "I am the last person who can expose the whole truth." Carson felt an icy shiver run down his spine. The thought of Catherine in danger made his heart clench in a way he had never experienced before. "I won't let that happen," he declared, his voice thick with determination. "Alexandra, get that press conference ready. Let's get everything out in the open before they have a chance to act." "Carson," Catherine interrupted, standing up. "If we do this, you will be exposed too. Your career..." "My career was built on lies," he cut her off gently. "Maybe it's time to build something new, something true. Starting with this." He turned to Alexandra. "How long do you need to organize a live broadcast?" "I can have everything ready in 2 hours," the lawyer replied, already typing on her phone. "But you guys need to be sure. Once we start..." "There's no going back," Catherine added, exchanging a meaningful look with Carson. "But maybe that's what Michael always wanted. The truth, no matter the cost." The next few hours were a whirlwind of preparations. While Alexandra coordinated with news networks, Carson and Catherine reviewed the documents they found, preparing to expose decades of corruption and manipulation. In a moment of calm before the storm, they found themselves alone in Gerald's library. Catherine was standing by the window, observing the city that had been the scene of so many lies and betrayals. "Are you sorry?" Carson asked softly, moving closer. "Of having started all this as Eleanor Banks?" Catherine turned to face him, her green eyes shining with a mix of determination and vulnerability. "The only thing I regret is not realizing it sooner." "Noticed what?" "That sometimes we find truth in the most unexpected places," she replied, taking a step towards him, "and that some people deserve a second chance." The moment between them was charged with unrealized possibilities, with unspoken words that seemed to hang in the air like specks of dust in sunlight. Alexandra's phone interrupted the moment. "Everything is ready. It's time." As they left Gerald's apartment, Carson took Catherine's hand, intertwining his fingers with hers. They were no longer the powerful CEO and the vengeful housekeeper. They were just two people united by the search for truth and the possibility of redemption. The city waited, unaware of the storm that was about to break. And at the center of it, Carson and Catherine prepared to face the consequences of exposing secrets kept for decades, knowing that the price of truth could be high, but the cost of silence would be even greater. The press room at the Ritz-Carlton in Manhattan was packed, cameras and microphones pointed at the empty stage like silent sentinels awaiting the moment of truth. Carson adjusted his tie for the last time, peering through a gap in the curtain at the sea of faces, eager for answers. "Ready?" he asked softly, turning to Catherine, who was finishing reviewing her notes. "Since I found Michael," she replied, her gaze meeting his with a mix of determination and vulnerability that made his heart race. Alexandra appeared, her professional expression masking the underlying tension. "The major networks are broadcasting live. Wall Street Journal, New York Times, they're all here. And..." She hesitated briefly. "We just received confirmation that 3 board members attempted to leave the country. The FBI intercepted them at the airport." Catherine nodded, a bitter smile playing on her lips. "Rats abandoning ship." "Gentlemen," a production assistant approached, "we're on the air in 2 minutes." Carson took Catherine's hand, feeling her cool skin against his. "Together?" "Together," she confirmed, intertwining her fingers with his. When they took the stage, the camera flashes created a storm of light. Catherine, in her navy blue suit, looked like a force of nature, so different from the discreet Eleanor Banks. Carson, at his side, exuded an aura of determination that few had seen from the normally controlled CEO. "Good afternoon," Catherine began, her voice clear and firm. "My name is Catherine Price, and I'm here to tell a story that began more than 3 decades ago, a story of power, betrayal, and the relentless search for truth." The next 2 hours were a meticulous exposé of documents, emails, and recordings that revealed the extent of the conspiracy that had run deep into the heart of corporate America. Carson watched in awe as Catherine led the narrative, her voice never wavering, even as she described the events that led to her brother's death. "Benjamin Walsh was not just the architect of an empire built on deception," she continued. "He was my biological father, a man who chose power over family, who orchestrated his own son's death to protect his secrets." A murmur ran through the audience. Carson stepped forward, taking the microphone. "As CEO of Montgomery Industries, I was an unwitting accomplice to a corrupt system," he admitted. "Today, I am here not only to expose the truth, but to take responsibility for my part in this story." As they alternated presenting evidence, Alexandria coordinated with FBI agents who began making arrests in real time. Executives who had built empires were being escorted from their offices, their shocked expressions captured by eager cameras. "What happened to Michael Price," Catherine concluded, her voice breaking for the first time, "cannot be undone. But his search for the truth, his sacrifice, will not be in vain." When the press conference ended, the American corporate world was in flames. Stocks plummeted, fortunes evaporated, and decades of institutionalized corruption came to light like a tsunami of revelations. Behind the scenes, away from the press, Catherine finally allowed her defenses to come down. Carson wrapped her in his arms, feeling her shoulders shake with sobs held back for so long. "It's over," he whispered into her hair. "You did it, Catherine. Michael would be proud." She pulled away slightly, her green eyes bright with tears meeting his. "We did it," he corrected softly. "You chose the hard path, Carson. You chose truth over power." "I chose you," he replied simply, touching her face reverently. "And I will continue to choose, every day." The moment was interrupted by Alexandra, who hurriedly entered the room. "We need to get you out of here. The press is going berserk, and there are still powerful people who—" "No," Catherine interrupted firmly. "No more hiding. No more shadows and secrets." Carson smiled, recognizing the strength that had attracted him from the first moment, even when she was Eleanor Banks. "She's right, Alexandra. It's time to face the light of day." Together they left the Ritz-Carlton through the main entrance, facing a sea of reporters and flashbulbs. Their hands remained intertwined, a simple gesture that said more than 1,000 words. "Where to now?" Catherine asked when they finally reached the waiting car. Carson considered for a moment before responding. How about the River Cafe? I think we owe that place one last visit. Catherine smiled, the first truly free smile he had ever seen on her face. A new beginning deserves a proper toast. As the car navigated the streets of Manhattan, the city seemed different, brighter, cleaner, as if a veil of lies had finally been removed. In the back seat, Carson and Catherine sat in comfortable silence, their hands still clasped, their hearts beating to the rhythm of a new story that was just beginning. The sun was setting over the East River, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, a spectacle that seemed to celebrate the triumph of truth over shadows. And at a table by the window of the River Cafe, a dethroned CEO and a redeemed avenger discovered that sometimes true power lies not in what we build, but in what we choose to deconstruct to rebuild something better, something real, something true.